our next story, which is a little bit of a difficult one, shall we say, to talk about. Um, this has got a reasonably happy slash sad ending. So what happened? Obviously, in the last week or so, just under a week now, if you're watching us live, unfortunately, the Russian Federation decided that they were going to not do what they said they weren't going to do, and they were surrounding Ukraine and on military exercises for several months and amassing at the border of Belarus and Ukraine, etc. And they invaded. Now, the international response to this has been universal. The condemnation of this has been rightly universal. And various organizations and agencies, FIFA, the Football Federation, the International Olympic Committee, athletics committees, got everyone, tennis, golf, everyone, arts committees, the Bolshoi Ballet, all sorts. Russia has basically been excluded now from all international operations in any capacity. You can't, have boat docking in British ports anymore. It's getting really, really serious. Now, one of the agencies that were kind of taking their time over this, and you can appreciate why, because the European Space Agency isn't just a single entity, it's 22 member states. And even though the United Kingdom came out of the EU, as it were, with Brexit a few years ago, which is probably the greatest catastrophe in modern British history in terms of science in particular, we are still a key part of the European Space Agency of ESA. The UK Space Agency, I've had many dealings with the UKSA and ESA. I used to work for ESA many years ago, contracting for them. It's a large organisation, and it's like the trees in Lord of the Rings. They take their time to discuss things. So last Friday, Joseph Ashbacher, who's the Director General of the European Space Agency, put out a statement that pretty much got everybody riled up, because whilst all of the other major organizations, governments, intergovernment agencies, the United Nations, etc., were condemning Russia and saying that they were going to impose massive sanctions on them. The ESA, the European Space Agency, was saying, well, we're still going to collaborate with Russia and we're going to monitor the situation. And that drove most of social media to go into meltdown in terms of condemnation of his statement. And I know from talking to friends at the UK Space Agency and at the European Space Agency, they were very, very dismayed by this statement. It wasn't, but it was a thing that they weren't allowed to talk about, because the UK Space Agency in particular, the civil servants, they're bound by government rules and regulations. They can't really talk about this stuff. It then kind of escalated, and much like it happened with the FIFA decision, whereas FIFA initially said, oh, Russia can play, but they can't fly under their own flag, etc. The level of public anger at this kind of drove ESA to kind of up their statement. So a couple of days later, they said, well, we're now monitoring the situation. And again, it really didn't cut the mustard, as it were. And, various people, ex-UK Space Agency, etc., were like, well, they're not really reading the room here. This is really, really quite significant. And the biggest problem for ESA was the upcoming launch of the ExoMars mission. So ExoMars was, planned from 2005. This is a multi-decade long planning and preparation, mission to land the first successful European Space Agency lander on the surface of Mars. They've had, previous attempts. Obviously, Beagle 2 got down to the surface of Mars. EDL worked flawlessly, but the deployment of the solar panels failed. The Schiaparelli mission dumped a ton of hydrazine all over the surface of Mars and was a complete catastrophe, although the orbiters have been very good. And this is the thing, that Russia were not only building the launch system with the Proton rockets, and I've always had major objections to that, because Russia have got a 0% success rate of ever getting anything to the surface of Mars. So it's almost like a jinx. It's like the kind of 13. You don't use 13 with any mission now since Apollo 13, etc. So that was a big part of the problem. But the even bigger part of the problem for ExoMars was the Kazakh lander. So the Kazakh lander basically is the landing system and was also some of the surface science. So the Rosalind Franklin rover was going to be basically put down on the surface by the Russian landing system, and it itself at its landing station was going to be doing an inordinate amount of surface science. Now, as I said, it started off in 2005. Around about 2009, NASA got involved in this, and they were going to be collaborating with the European Space Agency. Then they pulled out in 2012 and kind of left NASA and left ESA in the lurch, completely in the lurch. So ESA then approached Roscosmos, and let's not, we can't condemn the entirety of Russia. here. There are an awful lot of very, very good scientists, engineers, arts people, sports people, etc., who are fundamentally opposed to everything that's going on in Russia here. So let's not condemn everyone in Russia, but the head of Roscosmos, even late last week, was threatening operations on the ISS and saying, well, what are you going to do if we suddenly decide that we're not going to boost the orbits and stuff? It's like these veiled threats were not going down well with the international community. Now, the ISS has got its own set of protections and legal frameworks in place. And the astronauts on board, they're consummate professionals. They're not going to go, hopefully not trashing a $200 billion space station that's doing remarkable science. But the other missions, there was this inherent, you can't be involved with Russia anymore. And again, the public pressure was building and building and building. And now ESA have put out a third statement where they're saying, well, we now don't believe that ExoMars will launch this year. And instead of just saying it's cancelled. So there's still some kind of debate over the level of, constraint that they're putting on this. They're still leaving a little crack in the door, which they shouldn't be. I mean, Russia, Roscosmos head, he should be universally condemned as well. There's some really bad statements coming out. Vladimir Putin is threatening the entire world with nuclear weapons, and you can't take anything he says verbatim or as truth, because he said he wasn't going to invade Ukraine. So I think this condemnation of what's happening, whilst it's terribly sad for the scientists involved in the ExoMars mission, and I've got friends, people who work at Airbus, for example, in the UK, have been working on this for years, and there's a lot of scientists who've put in most of their careers into getting this mission. And it's not just ExoMars, you've then got the sample return. This was a whole kind of series of missions that were designed to, the Fetch rover and the orbiter, etc., designed to bring back the first surface samples from Mars, for laboratory analysis. So there's a whole ton of knock-on implications here. Now, what can ESA do? Well, clearly launching anything with Roscosmos is a big no-no right now, and there's a whole other debate going on with OneWeb at the moment. OneWeb is a big mega constellation provider, part owned by the British government. There's a massive $400-500 million investment from the British government into them as well. They're planning on launching from Kazakhstan on a Soyuz rocket in the next few days, and again, they're not getting a lot of good publicity over this because they should be pulling out. And it's really interesting to see what they're going to do, because they've got a lot invested in this, and it's a really difficult situation. I'm talking to a few people and some people in the chat here on Twitter today, it's a really difficult situation for them because they've got this massive investment in OneWeb. Now, we've all got our opinions on OneWeb and Starlink, etc., and we hate the whole debris potential threat and the light pollution issues and the astronomy issues, etc., that are being caused by these constellations. And my hat doff tip to Elon Musk and his I'm going to send Starlinks into Ukraine. That was a good move, in terms of helping the Ukrainian people. But Putin's already proven, and we talk about the ASAT test in a bit, via his ASAT, anti-satellite weapons test, that he's not afraid to take out stuff in orbit either. So there's a whole ton of issues here. So what would ESA do? Well, could they use, a different launch system? Yes, integration into the fairing, the rover integration into the fairing is not a big problem. So putting the rover in a different mission, not so much of an issue, the rover part anyway. In terms of the lander, that's a whole other ball game, because the landing mechanism obviously has been designed around this Russian landing system. Now, obviously, Adam Steltzner and his amazing team out of JPL and etc., and the NASA team, who have successfully landed 2 rovers the size of Mini Coopers on the surface of Mars with the Sky Crane that everybody said wasn't going to work, and it worked flawlessly. That to me would seem like a logical option. But then the re-engineering of all of this and the surface science, etc., that came from the Kazachok lander, that's not trivial. This is not a quick fix. And 2 years sounds like a long time, but believe me, in the space sector, it isn't. It's a really, really rapid amount of time. So developing something in that space of time, not going to happen. What could happen? Well, if what happens, what develops in Ukraine develops hopefully in a positive way for the Ukrainian people and the West, in that hopefully Putin may be deposed. We don't want to talk about the politics too much, but something needs to happen. Then possibly collaboration with Roscosmos could occur again, because they've got some great scientists. They're not bad people, not all of them anyway.